As the UK Defence Attache to the Russian Federation from 2019 to 2022, John Foreman advised senior UK officials and ministers on Russian military and security affairs and represented the UK Chief of Defence Staff to the Russian General Staff. He had a front row seat for the tense meetings and negotiations that immediately preceded Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine in February 2022. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely comment against the videos. It's never been more important to get the messages of our fantastic speakers out to a wider audience. John Foreman is an independent consulting specialist on Russia, Ukraine, and international security with over 20 years of diplomatic, operational, and corporate experience in the defense and security sector. I'll put a full description because his bio could take up probably most of the episode here. But I should also note that this is the second time he's been on the channel, and I highly recommend you watch that first video as well. He is known for his punchy views on the topic, which I think many people on the channel will share. John, welcome back.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think the length of my biography is linked to my age and my retirement.
There's a certain amount of achievement in there, dare I say it. My biography would be somewhat more sparse if comparing them there. But let's dive straight into one of the tricky topics, which I think shines a spotlight on the weakness of leadership and weakness of the core Western strategy towards Ukraine. And that is the disquiet that is being expressed about Ukraine's, what I think, extremely powerful strategy to target Russia's refinery capacity, not production of crude, but the refinement into fuel, such as petrol, which of course is absolutely critical for the war effort and critical for Russia's war machine, which is assaulting Ukraine on a daily basis. Why is the US trying to impose these red lines and express this disquiet at a strategy which may seem to those who look at history to be, rather sensible and validated?
Well, thank you for inviting me back, firstly, Jonathan. I think 6 months ago, we spoke about the drift of leadership from Washington in particular, and their sort of approach, which has seen themselves deter themselves from certain measures. Throughout, it strikes me that the Russians have had an escalation edge over the Americans, and the Russians have actually achieved what they want to achieve, is to induce fear into certain sectors of the US decision-making process, in particular the administration. Now, it's easy for me to point fingers at various officials, but I think this comes from the top, comes from President Biden's personal approach to the conflict. Remember, he didn't really speak about Ukraine for 18 months, and then he was going to talk about it. That got overtaken by the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, and then he sort of put the thing together to present to the American people. So he's never really explained to the American people what the core interests are to America, why it matters to Americans, and why America should be leading the response. So you see these red lines on ATACMS, for example. We'll provide ATACMS, the cluster variant. We won't provide the unitary warhead variant. We'll provide some equipment, but not enough to quite enable the Ukrainians to defeat the Russians in the field. We'll provide new small diameter bombs with a limited range. And this whole idea that we'll give you F-16s, I saw that this week, these F-16s can only defend, quote, Ukrainian territory. They can't take the battle to Russia. And I think this sort of clever strategy which the Ukrainians came about, they've developed long-range unmanned vehicles, now with maybe perhaps 2,000 kilometers, enables them to bring under fire, to place at risk Russia's refining capability, deliberately not to affect the export of oil, because actually Russia exports crude oil and very few relatively refined products, but actually to target domestic refinery of oil products, and in particular to target the motorization of the Russian war machine, whether it's in the air or on the ground, and also the supporting logistics infrastructure, which is supporting the armed forces. And again, I think the very unfortunate comments, if they're true, by the Financial Times today, are part of that sort of overall reluctance or leading from behind strategy, which I think has seen the Western strategy towards Ukraine and Russia really run into the sands over the last 6 months.
And is there a historical precedent for hitting the kind of capabilities we're talking about here, the refined oil products, and how much of that capacity do they need to take out in order to actually have an impact on the Russian economy and, crucially, on the war effort, on actually getting these petrol-powered vehicles to the front and the sort of logistics and supply lines?
Sure, I think we focus on diesel, but it's also on unleaded, it's also on lubricants, it's also on bottled gas, it's also to do with aviation fuel. So those are the products that come out of this process in refineries. And I saw so far Ukraine's, on paper, has hit X%, I don't know, in principle, half of refining capability. They obviously don't know how much the hits have been successful, and then Russia can rebuild. But Russia's got a problem with rebuilding these refineries because of the lack of technology, Western technology. You can't just put in a Chinese bit or a Russian bit into a Western refinery. But I think you have to measure by the output on prices. And so we've seen increase in prices inside Russia quite quickly due to the reduction of refining capacity. In terms of history, well, obviously the Allies spent 18 months, almost 2 years, flattening German refining capability in the Second World War for specifically this purpose. And people look at the impacts, and some may say, well, no, it didn't really have the same impact. But actually, Germans said after the war to the Americans that it had a massive impact on their war machine. And again, the Americans did the same against Saddam in 1991 and indeed 2003. Again, trying to separate a more indiscriminate attack on energy infrastructure, which the Russians have been doing yesterday in Ukraine, from a more targeted approach against refinery, to basically stop the Iraqi, at the time, the Iraqi army in its place, and to enable greater advantage to the American side. So the strategy can work. The Ukrainians developed the weapons and have the strategy. They've identified, I think, a weak spot in the economy. If the Americans are now trying to stop that, then it really places, in my mind, what the Americans are trying to achieve in Ukraine.
Is it possible to
encourage Ukraine to surrender?
Well, is it possible to characterize the American strategy as escalation management leading to stalemate as opposed to victory? And again, that's very much part of the, managing the escalatory ladder, and maybe even the thinking that if Putin retains some Ukrainian territory, you won't be tempted to go further in that escalatory response. First of all, is that conjecture correct? But if it is, isn't it the most tremendous failure? Because whereas we have seen a certain stalemate on the land war, we are certainly not seeing a stalemate in the sea war or the air war, where Ukraine is gaining dominance through its innovative technologies. But we also see this extraordinary incursion into Russian territory, into Belgorod Oblast and Kursk, with the insurgent army that has been built up. And I think, this may have been able to move much earlier, but due to American pressure, when America was supplying funds, they were able to put a certain amount of leverage on Ukraine not to accelerate that strategy. But we've had 6 months of non-supply by the US, really, in any significant terms. Have they lost control of the situation? And is escalation management not just disastrous, but a complete failure?
Well, I have some sympathy with the Americans, because obviously they're confronted as the world's superpower with a rogue regime with the world's largest nuclear weapons arsenal and an aging despot who's just rigged beginning elections and claims he's on a messianic mission to reclaim historic lands in Ukraine. So at every stage, I can understand why the Americans have been very careful not to let this thing spin out of control and to go to places where we don't want to go. As conversely, what Russians have said to us, it signals to the West, privately and in public, that they don't want to escalate the war beyond the local war into a regional conflict with NATO. So inside that conflict at the local level, the Americans have obviously been very careful in the way they've been supplying arms, the way they've been allowing or not allowing Ukraine to do stuff. But I think the problem is that Russia is prepared to go further. And that's because we're not quite clear on what the American goals are, whether it's to return to 1991 borders, is Crimea in, Crimea out, is it to achieve some sort of status quo of the rump, quote unquote, of Ukraine. I think that's led into this sort of uncertainty, which I think the Russians exploit by signalling if we can take over the whole country of Ukraine, like Medvedev said, like Russians are saying, we're going to subjugate all Ukrainians for a big mass emigration, threatening nuclear, or using nuclear rhetoric, which people pick up quite quickly, or saying that the process of the army is rebuilding is going on, which means that we're preparing for war, or talk of further mobilization. So I think the approach needs to be reconsidered, shall we say, because I think Americans got themselves on the back foot, to use a British metaphor. They are lagging, as you said, the arms haven't been there. There's a sense of drift, and it comes to, in the end, of Secretary Austin coming to Ramstein and talking a good game, but he's got nothing to back it up. And I think that also places pressure on the Europeans, because the Europeans are going, well, hold on, if America's not reliable over Ukraine, what else is it going to be unreliable about? Is it reliable on European security, and what's it mean for our European security future? And hence, I think that's why you see people like Macron expressing concern, and that Europe must do more. So yeah, I think it's they have not lost control of the situation, but I think there's that sort of gentle sense of drift, and I think that drift's only going to continue as we get closer to the elections in November, until such time that the political future of America becomes clearer. You're not going to see dramatic decisions because everything's been seen through the lens of re-election.
And do you think they do have a sense of, we can't know exactly, there's discussions and policies there, but do they have a sense that there's a certain status quo? Better the devil you know, Putin's a monster, but it's a monster we are familiar with. And yet on the ground, we see a situation which, even for the experts, I think, is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Up until this point, it's been relatively predictable. If you listen to Keir Charles and others, they've been fairly, I would say, robust on saying, what's going to happen, how we should react. Now, with Ilya Ponomarev as the spokesman of the Russian Free Battalions, who seem to still be at play, liberating villages in Belgorod and Kursk, there's no clear view, even amongst experts, on whether this is still, a symbolic incursion, or whether this can snowball in the way that, revolutionary movements in Cuba and others have had a tendency to start with small groups and then grow into major kind of historical events. No one seems to know where this could end up, but at the extremes of the scales, there's the possibility here that this could result in widespread civil war on the territory of Russia. Now, I've heard that word civil war going back to the 90s, never believed it was possible. At this point, it's not completely improbable.
Yeah, I mean, on these free Russians, they've got a handful of kilometers inside Russia. I see them more as an irritant and a raid to distract attention from the Russian main effort, which is Donbass, not as a sort of fomenting of a revolution inside Russia itself. And of course, Putin's still got huge numbers of security forces to throw at the problem, whether it's the Russian Guard, whether it's the FSB, whether it's other bits of the army which haven't been deployed into Ukraine itself. So I see that as a slight side issue. And of course, there's no opposition inside Russia per se, because Putin thinks he's got control of the situation with the FSB and everything post-election, and having demonstrated that the Russian people, quote, love him, and that he has the trust of the Russian people. I don't think anybody's going to put their head above the parapet to support these people, especially if they're being called traitors. And he's called on the FSB to basically kill them all. But I think on the wider issue about, is Putin a known monster? Well, there was that editorial in The Guardian today from Simon Jenkins talking the same thing about the fictitious, quote, stability of the Cold War, where Soviet Union's in its camp, we're in our camp, and we have a big war, and we sort of manage along. And the whole thing about containment, which I think is erroneous, because I think Putin's not in the same league of thinkers as the communist leaders who had a very firm ideology behind them. And as Putin gets older, more, we say, rational, or rational in his own way, which we get as irrational, and more convinced of his own destiny and convinced about worrying about his legacy. I think that is erroneous to try and think that we can do some deal with Ukraine, over Ukraine, slice off the occupied territories, and he'll settle for that. I think his immediate strategy at the moment is to win back Donbass, take a breather, and then re-attack. And if we allow that, per Mr. Jenkins or some parts of the American foreign policy elite in Washington, to basically focus on China and bed down the problem in Ukraine, I think it'll come back and continue to jeopardize European security. Yeah.
And this is not the, dare I say it, the first moment of weakness that Mr. Jenkins has displayed. If you go back and look at his back catalogue of materials, along with people like Samuel Charap and others, there seems to be an extraordinary trend of narratives which one could interpret as being favourable to the Kremlin. No, it wouldn't dare.
Well, I think it's also, I'm not naming names, but I think, we in our country have had a history of thinkers just think that we can appease dictators. Now, you'd think we would know the perils of that approach, that we don't give way to terrorists, we don't parley with monsters, that we stand true to our values, and that peace ultimately leads to catastrophe. Unfortunately, these individuals with big voices continue to make that argument, anything for quiet life. And you see it in the comments of some of the shows or online. People say, look, we'd be poking the bear. It's all Russia's actions are a response to our actions. Russia's innocent. All they want is security and their, quote, historic lands, which aren't their lands. And I think that narrative, I don't agree with it, but it's made, and it certainly has a grip on some parts of the American administration. And their voice is heard, which at a time where I think somebody with a bit more conviction, like Reagan or Kennedy, would say, no, this is completely incorrect, especially America. Now, I mean, I think in terms of the UK, actually, you notice the line, there's no line between what the front benches, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party would say, even Liberal Democrats, or the Scottish Nationalists, we're all on the same side because we know our history, and we know twice in the 100 years the perils of trying to do cut deals with tyrants. Unfortunately, that lesson seems to be lost to some people.
And I think you sort of answered this, but this is something that I've been asked in recent days and weeks by Ukrainians, and not in a negative way. This is almost a sort of bemusement, but it's a delighted bemusement. And they ask, there seem to be significant red lines in Washington, significant red lines in Berlin, until Macron, suddenly had an about turn in the last couple of weeks. There seem to be significant red lines in the thinking of Paris as well. And they ask, well, why does Britain not seem to have quite the same imposition of red lines? And why do we seem to be not so susceptible to the nuclear blackmail and terror message? I don't know if you have any ideas.
Well, I mean, I think, I watched Boris Johnson speak live in the House of Commons on the evening of February 24th and his address to the nation. And I think he and other members of the front bench, both sides, sort of grasp it as a moral issue, not just as a narrow issue of territory or front lines or whatever, where the front line was. It was actually a moral issue. And also we can use our history to say what's happening to Ukraine happened to us. The bombings we see in Kiev happened in London. I'm a Londoner. My grandmothers were both bombed out. It's a legacy. It's a sort of a public. It's within our sort of society the risks of going down that path. But I think for Germany, I think obviously their experience of the war is completely different. They lost, and I think Chancellor Scholz represents a very strong strand within German thinking about being close to the Russians, also turning from their previous crimes in Russia. And I think Scholz is, in particular, very prone to draw up red lines, which are nonsensical, as we've seen over towards missiles, over the supply of even non-lethal weapons or non-lethal arms and lethal arms from the very beginning. And that, though he talks a good game, he's always trying to put obstacles in the way of actually supplying Ukrainians the stuff they need. Now, I'm thinking, on the whole, Germany supplied an awful lot of stuff, but I wish we didn't have to go through this existential angst every time an idea comes up before the Germans finally budge and give tanks or Marders or F-16s or weapons.
And we've done an
I think
episode on that as well, which is to an extent misplaced war guilt, because they place that guilt against Russia and Russians and conceive of it as it's a debt, historical debt to Russia, whereas actually the greatest material loss was to Ukrainian cities and, of course, as a proportion of the population.
And just on the Macron issue, I'm very encouraged that Macron's finally come out of his great rethink of his policy. I think his approach before the invasion was incorrect. His idea that he could talk Putin out of this was misjudged. I think the whole French system misjudged the situation. The French intelligence chief was sacked. And obviously they had to go back to basics to say, hold on, why did we get it so wrong? What is Russia up to? What does it mean for us? And now, if Macron's deliberations and his statements come through in terms of supplying weapons, creating strategic ambiguity, shall we say, in Ukraine, getting the European Union to step up more and help provide both arms to Ukraine and also strengthen the European pillar to NATO. That's all good things. But I think Macron's had a history of saying one thing and doing yet another thing. So one week he's saying we're going to stand by Ukraine till the end. The next week he's providing or placing economic sanctions on Ukrainian exports along with the Poles. So, or putting blocks in the way of using European money to supply weapons to Ukraine. So, yeah, I think I'll judge him on results, not on what his words say. Words are cheap.
And if we go back to actual sort of results, last time we talked, we spoke a little bit about the closeness of British military planning and also Britain forming a kind of role as liaison with the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, there's been quite a few changes since then, but I wonder whether those changes are reinforcing rather than eroding. We've got Admiral Radikin as a kind of essentially a go-between between the US and Ukrainian forces. There was an article, I think, in The Guardian about that around the time we spoke. But things have changed. General Zaluzhny is now coming to the UK as ambassador, and one could interpret that as actually a strengthening of military cooperation and communication. But I'm not sure what your view is.
Yeah, but I would say we've had a very long, close and deep relationship with Ukraine. I think we were the fourth country to recognise its independence, 1991. That's why I had 004 on my number plates when I was in Ukraine. We're providing training and support to Ukraine and its military since that time. That ramped up after 2014. Britain led the way with the Americans around about 21 to late 21, early 22. We've been supporting Ukraine throughout its trials against the Russians. I mean, I don't necessarily think that relationship is damaged by General Zaluzhny coming to London or his replacement, General Syrskyi. I saw that Grant Shapps was in Kiev, Tony Radikin was back in Kiev. The big difference is we've signed a UK-Ukraine security relationship since then, in terms of providing long-term support, technical support, weapons, etc., to Ukraine for its own security, not security guarantees, but security assurances. So I did think at the time when General Zaluzhny was replaced that President Zelensky was quite within his rights to try and shake the team up, to have this reboot. Obviously, the Ukrainian offensive failed. When we last spoke, it was still in the process of failing. It failed. After that, there's always going to be a reckoning. I think Zelensky's got a new team in, not just at the general, but all the way through the system. Hungary, Alina generals are coming up through the system, as they always do in war. Adon Zaluzhny himself, obviously we know him, the British know him very well. I had a long relationship with him during the war. I think there's a personal rapport between himself, Tony Radikin, and others. But of course, his role in London will be different. He won't be a mill-to-mill link. He'll be the representative of Ukraine writ large. So we'll have to see how he adapts to that role, which is very different from being in the field. And there's history of those generals who succeed in that different role, so more diplomatic role, and those who don't. So we'll just have to see how it gets on. But I think, if anything, since last spoke, the UK-Ukrainian relationship has only got deeper.
And another topic which I notice you've been very vocal on social media and other platforms is what seems to be a certain hysteria. And this isn't just a media hysteria. This also seems to be a hysteria amongst certain analysts as well, saying that what Russia's going to do next is directly seek military confrontation with NATO, with potentially invasion of one or more NATO countries. Now, I know you don't exactly align with that, but I'm interested to drill into that. What might Russia do? Why would it seek a direct confrontation or an indirect one for that matter? What should we be preparing for?
Yeah, I mean, I just noticed since January, there was an increasing number of, should we say, wilder statements from all quarters. The head of chief of general staff outgoing talks about being a pre-war period. So did Grant Shapps. Other leaders were saying that we had to prepare for war with Russia within 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. And actually, it was hard to work out where this was coming from in the absence of any specific intelligence, because obviously, if there was specific intelligence, I imagine the Americans would do what they did before the invasion and either brief it out or go and talk to the Russians. We've seen no sign of that. In fact, even the Americans themselves, in the latest intelligence assessment for this year, said it was almost certain, quote, quote, that Russia did not seek a direct conventional military conflict with NATO. So the question is, why is this war fever about? There's obviously anxiety about the war in Ukraine, and that Ukraine fails, Russia will be closer to Europe. And also there's a sort of idea of there might be a sort of domino effect, perhaps. I think there's some people are saying that Europe's weak. We're weak, and we've got weak president, and weak leaders, and everything's going bad after, and we've got no money, and the economy's static, and there's lots of squabbling. And others, I think, are using the threat of a Russian attack to justify their particular hobby horses, whether it's tanks or whether it's more defence spending or bigger armies, more ships, aircraft, whatever it is. So I think it's a number of reasons, but I think, as I said in my article in The Spectator a couple of weeks back, I don't think Russia has the intent or the capability to attack NATO directly. Tony Radakin said that Britain was safe. We're part of the biggest alliance. He reminded the Russians of our nuclear weapons and the fact that the guarantee, the Article 5 guarantee remains inviolate, that there can be no sort of trading off various bits of NATO, quote, peace with Russia. And President Biden said the same thing. So I think more likely is not a conventional attack against NATO as an indirect attack, which the Russians have been doing for decades. As I said in the Spectator, Putinism is a malignant parasite that feeds on diseased tissue. And that's why they're using the tactic to go after European, to try and defeat us and trying to demoralize us. A, because they don't want to attack us directly, and B, they think it's going to have more bang for their buck. So somebody Russian said they try and defeat the enemy through the force of politics, not through the politics of force. And a Russian general wrote that they assessed that the indirect approach can have 3 times the effect of the direct approach in defeating the enemy and demoralizing it. And of course, information and propaganda and assassinations and influence peddling and dirty money, degradation of our democracy can actually reduce the fighting potential of the enemy before any fighting, as Gerasimov said. So I think that's the approach, and I think that's what we could guard against. And this fixation about 2%, 2.5%, 2.4%, 2.8%, 3% is actually a bit of a sideshow, because it doesn't really go off the fact that if we don't defend our societies and our democracies, our freedoms, then actually there'll be no will to use the armed forces implements in the event of a direct confrontation with Russia.
And that's what we see a lot of investment going into information warfare, um, certainly targeting certain sort of European countries which are more vulnerable to that and have a slightly more ambiguous view on the morality around Russia's invasion. But we see it also playing out on the African continent in the so-called global south, India. Goodness me, the Vatican as well seems to have really sipped from that Kool-Aid as well.
Yep.
Are we, we may not be going onto a war economy footing. Russia clearly is, but are we going onto a war informational footing? Are we really stepping up our efforts to counter what is likely to be the biggest threat from Russia, especially in a year which is going to see a record number of elections taking place? And elections, fantastic for democracy, but it's a weak point which Russian disinformation campaigns could target.
Well, I mean, I would hope so, but I fear that the Russian threat is not seen as a domestic threat in the same way as it was during the Cold War. The Russian threat is seen through the Ukrainian lens, 3 hours away. It's over there. It's somebody else's problem and not a domestic challenge. Now, you see people like Security Minister Tom Tugendhat, the House of Commons Select Committee, others talking about the actual challenge. But what does it actually translate through into actual action? We had an integrated review refresh a year ago and made our policy towards Russia one of containment. But has that policy worked its way through the system into a consistent set of measures to counteract the sort of thing we're talking about? Now, there have been measures. There's talk about espionage. There's talk about going after dirty money. There's use of these unexplained wealth orders. There's also sanctions. There's also efforts to sort of strengthen or talk about social media, how news spreads on those systems. But it doesn't strike me as being particularly coherent. I couldn't tell you who's in charge of Russian policy. I of course couldn't tell you who's in charge of delivering containment of Russia. So you'll get beneath these buzzwords: contain Russia, defend, deter, and actually invest in what we actually mean. Now, whether that's renewing the nuclear deterrent, whether that's strengthening our conventional forces, but also addressing the vigor and health of our own society and protecting it. I'm not convinced. And I think if we do one thing, and I think once this political certainty this year is over, because obviously America's got its own political uncertainty, so do we. I think whoever wins is going to have to hold a security and defence review again, and then we'll have to address this in more detail. But I think the realisation of Russia as a significant long-term chronic threat to us is only slowly trickling through the system. And I still think there's parts of it that don't see it as a threat at all.
That of course is concerning, but it very much echoes the responses we're seeing, which are a lackluster drip feeding weaponry and so on, which does not seem up to the task. Let's stick with the US though, because we have this crucial election coming up. If Trump wins, that brings with it significant uncertainties about his approach to NATO, Ukraine, and a whole variety of issues, including European defense. If Biden wins, we have the strategy of, I would say, escalation management, which is in some ways a disaster if you look at it in terms of the number of Ukrainian lives that are being lost because of what we discussed earlier, which is a clear inarticulation of outcomes and supplying weaponry to achieve those definable outcomes. I mean, that's not happening. Therefore, there is a tangible cost, and the cemeteries are filling up in Ukraine as a result of that. But given these scenarios and given the election coming up, what could be implications for the UK and its role, and how will Russia try to manipulate the situation to its advantage?
Well, I think certainly, I think firstly on Biden, as Andrew Neil said, I think he's generally asleep at the wheel. And there's been general drift about in global leadership, not just towards Ukraine and Russia, but elsewhere, Iran, ceding space elsewhere. He seems to be afraid of using American power to his extent to confront the challenges America faces. I think on Trump, I think there's all that stuff, statements about campaigning in poetry and governing in prose. I think it's hard to work out exactly what he means, but he was talking to Farage, and he's made a speech. I mean, he does things in transactional terms, and actually, he gave a mighty push to get NATO to start countries to start spending more money on their own defence. And he seemed to throw back from his earlier comments in front of a crowd to say, actually, you know, if you pay your way, we'll defend you. If you don't, we won't. Now, fortunately, a lot of European countries have got the message in the last 10 years, but there's still a lot of laggards, you know, Italy and Spain, Portugal, Belgium. But there is movement in that direction. So we'll also have to see, I think. So I agree, it brings uncertainty. In terms of the UK position, I think it comes back to that point about defence and deterrence. You know, we picture ourselves, or we paint ourselves as the strongest military in Europe, mainly because we've got nuclear weapons, but also what we bring, and also the political resolve, and also sort of the work we do in the corridors of power in NATO and with bilateral allies. And also, as we spoke about before, the respect we have for actually standing up for our principles and not just bending over. I think if Biden I think whatever happens within Trump or Biden wins, both potential presidents bring a degree of uncertainty, I think, about the US approach to Europe versus China, whether either will actually back up their words. And I think it goes back to that point of actually making sure that our defences and deterrence and our role within NATO is credible, and that means more investment. So whatever happens, I think the pressure to increase defence spending to 2.5% is likely. And I think that's what Labour have been signalling.
And the other aspect of this, and given the unanimity in the UK, which is fairly unique, and this interesting transition period with the new ambassador potentially being validated and appointed, what does Ukraine need, and how can Britain help? And I'm thinking in particular here of things like technology cooperation. These things may already be happening, but how we can scale it up. Also, the investment in Ukraine's own domestic defense industry and the creation of foreign manufacturing plants. There seems to be an interesting way that Germany could get around its various conundrums, and that is building capacity, including the Rheinmetall plants in Ukraine itself. Gets around the domestic political issues. But we also have the seizure, or the potential seizure of Russian central bank assets. These are all issues on which Britain does not seem to have any particular red lines. And could deliver potentially huge benefit, and where various European partners, as you say, are either playing politics or have other reasons why they may not move as fast or even block some of these changes. So how important is the UK going to be, especially if we have an isolationist US, in really pushing forward these priorities that Ukraine needs to survive in the first instance, but also move towards some concept of victory?
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever happens, I think the UK, and France's role in galvanizing, quote, European small e security, not necessarily European Union or NATO, but European security, will be vital. That's why the partnership between the UK and France is absolutely essential. I mean, I think some of the things you've spoken about is already in the works. There's a partnership with BAE Systems. I think Babcock's are heavily involved. There's been defence industrial discussions between UK, Ukraine, and partners. As you say, you need to move away from a sort of donor receiver mentality into building long-term capacity for Ukraine, whether it's in Ukraine, their own factories, they have their own scientists, their own ingenuity, notwithstanding the fact that's under threat from Russian long-range air attack, or the capacity for Ukraine to buy arms in on a commercial basis, have its own contracts, have regular supply through such things as perhaps getting bonds issued off the seized Russian assets, which is considerable, which I think the G7 is moving towards. I think on the British side, there's obviously these different coalitions of new capabilities. So the French have said they lose long-range weapons. I think the British have talked about drones and also sea at the maritime. It's unsurprising. We live on an island. Others will do tanks, armor vehicles, aircraft, air defense, electronic warfare, whatever. But I think the value added of our ingenious scientists, information, AI target, that's why I think our value added will be our technical advantage, bringing them so that Ukraine can offset Russian quantity with Ukrainian quality, which I think General Sierski has spoken about, having an asymmetric edge, exploiting the weaknesses of the Russian armed forces, its rigidity, its inability to change, and its very hierarchical nature, and its fratricidal sort of character. I think that's where we can particularly help, as well as also having one of the global financial centres in the world as a major financial power to galvanise financial support and political support towards Ukraine.
And the last question, I think, is probably going to be a tricky one. So we've talked about various blockages that happen for various policy reasons, either because of misguided strategy or self-correcting or self-limiting behaviors because of beliefs, propaganda, etc. But we also must look at bureaucratic inertia. And in that respect, I guess Britain is as vulnerable as anybody else to the sort of labyrinthine processes and lack of individual imagination that will often, block things happening or grind them and slow them down to the point where, they become issues. I'm thinking in particular of two things, one positive and one negative example. One, of course, is the personal initiative in the Czech Republic to find and source shells and just cut through these bureaucratic barriers. Everyone knows that these shells are important. Everyone knows they need to be provided, but they get bogged down in special economic interest, bureaucratic empire building, and just general incompetence. We have a similar debate going on, I think, about migrant boats, which potentially could be repurposed and sent over to Ukraine, or just delivered and let them, reconstruct them. But they are being cut up and destroyed here in the UK. But again, that seems to be sort of, one part of bureaucracy not knowing what the other part's doing and a lack of communication. How are there initiatives to cut through this? Are there departments being created that have a bigger strategic objective that can railroad through these sectional interests and deliver stuff with purpose, like the Czech campaign around 155mm ammunition is doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, I spent a long time in the armed forces, came across the Ministry of Defence. I worked in America, I worked in the UK, I worked in NATO, and I worked in the European Union. No country is immune from bureaucracy. It is, especially peacetime. And I would put the UK as better than most, worse than some. I mean, you have this image of America as this land of the free. Believe me, the bureaucracy inside the DoD is enormous. And go to take that and multiply it by 10 and get to the European Union. I think it's just a fact of life. And I think for example, on the Czech deal, that shows that it's a coalition of willing, really, that certain nations come together under leadership of one who's identified opportunity to get on with it. I think that's fantastic. Like we provided EDLAWs or the British provided Storm Shadows. As long as it's coordinated through the Ramstein process, there's nothing, it's not some labyrinthine process to stop anybody doing something, i.e. putting it under NATO, which would just slow the whole thing down. I think that's why the benefits of the Ramstein contact group approach is to let people get on and do stuff with a lighter touch rather than, as you say, putting these barriers in place. I know, inside the MOD, there are various task forces which are specifically devoted to training, equipment support, operational support. And they were formed, as you said, to cut through some of the red tape. However, having worked in Whitehall, seen Whitehall operate from Moscow, there's always going to be factional interests between different departments. And I think the boats thing, I didn't know about the boats thing, but I think one interesting debate was vehicles seized in London under the emission zone were going to be scrapped. And somebody said, well, why don't we give them to the Ukrainians? That's a good idea. Initiative. And it got run into the bureaucracy, and there's various sort of obstacles placed in its way until Ben Wallace got involved, other people got involved. It was all sorted out. The Treasury came in. There was a tax waiver. It was sorted out. I think actually the British system can react quite well to those initiatives, and I think when there's political will, it'd be able to railroad it through the system. I think we're better than quicker. We have shown throughout the whole process. It was us that challenged tanks first, A, to get it done, and B, to galvanise others more reluctant to the Germans. It's us to send missiles first to place the pressure on the Germans to provide Taurus. It shows we have actually been quite responsive, and I think on the whole, the machinery of government works, notwithstanding a few ups and downs.
That's heartening to hear, and that's probably a good place to end the discussion. The role of Britain seems to be absolutely pivotal and may become more so, and that's why it's so good to speak to you, John, and get that sort of inside view, especially as you have, as you say, experience of so many different institutions that need to come together in the current situation and understand the strategic importance of supporting Ukraine and developing a concept of victory, and then acting according to that. We're not quite there yet. Hopefully in 6 months' time, things will have moved on significantly further.
Right, thank you.